It was a chilly, wet evening in downtown Manhattan. The glow from towering buildings shimmered on the rain-soaked pavement, while the faint wail of sirens mixed with the quick steps of people rushing to escape the storm. Ethan Blake, a wealthy businessman famous for his cutthroat strategies and emotional distance, was navigating his high-end vehicle through a less crowded street. It was unusual for him to be by himself, without bodyguards or a chauffeur, but tonight he wanted solitude. His thoughts were consumed by his recent purchase of a tech firm set to disrupt the industry. Suddenly, something unexpected snapped him out of his reverie. A small child dashed into the road directly in front of his car. Ethan hit the brakes hard, his pulse quickening. Exiting the car, his typically stoic expression was confronted with a scene straight from a movie. A woman was crouched on the wet road, comforting a boy no older than 5, who was crying in fear. A shabby man in tattered clothes loomed over them, his stance menacing. Just as he was about to strike the woman, Ethan stepped in, ordering the man to back off. Ethan's voice was firm and authoritative, causing the man to pause briefly. However, the man wasn't easily scared. He sneered at Ethan, sizing him up. The woman, shielding the boy, glanced up at Ethan, her eyes tearful, silently begging for assistance. "Who do you think you are?" the man hissed, his voice filled with venom. Ethan moved closer, locking eyes with the man. "The last person you want to mess with tonight," Ethan replied, his tone calm but edged with threat. The man seemed to consider his options as the rain intensified, heightening the tension. Then, without a word, he retreated into the shadows of the city streets. Ethan knelt beside the woman and the boy, trying to appear less intimidating. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice gentler. The woman, still shaking, nodded as she clutched the boy tightly. She was young, with eyes that seemed burdened with many fears. The boy, still whimpering, clung to her as if his life depended on it. I don't know how to thank you," the woman whispered, her voice faint. Ethan dismissed the situation lightly. "Let's get you out of the rain," he said. Helping them up, he led them to his car, and despite her reluctance, the woman accepted his offer. As he drove through the rain-drenched streets, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that this night, which had started so ordinarily, might alter his life forever. Upon arriving at a high-end hotel, Ethan secured a room for the woman and the boy. Before departing, he asked for her name. "Sophia," she replied, her voice slightly shaky. "And this is my son, Max." Ethan nodded. Before he left, he handed her a card with his number. "If you need anything at all, don't hesitate to call me." Sophia watched him leave, her heart still racing. She knew this unexpected encounter with Ethan Blake would change their lives forever, but she had no idea just how intertwined their lives were about to become. The next morning, Ethan sat in his penthouse, gazing at the New York skyline. The previous night's events lingered in his mind, a persistent curiosity he couldn't ignore. He rarely got involved in others' personal lives, but something about Sophia and her son had left an impression on him. His phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. It was his assistant, James, always efficient. "Mr. Blake, there's a meeting with the legal team at 10 a.m. to finalize the tech firm acquisition," James informed him, his tone steady. "Reschedule it for the afternoon," Ethan replied abruptly, surprising himself. He usually wouldn't postpone such a crucial meeting, but today he felt compelled to follow up on last night's events. After making a few calls, Ethan learned more about Sophia. Her last name was Martinez, a single mother living in a small, dilapidated apartment in a tough neighborhood. The man who had attacked her was Victor Steele, a known enforcer for a local loan shark. This revelation stirred something deep within Ethan, a mix of anger and protectiveness he hadn't felt in years. He decided to visit Sophia. When he arrived at the hotel, she seemed startled to see him. Her eyes were swollen from a restless night, and Max clung to her leg, peeking out cautiously. "Mr. Blake, I didn't expect to see you again," Sophia said, her voice a mix of gratitude and unease. "Please call me Ethan," he said. offering a reassuring smile. "I want to make sure you were okay. May I come in?" Sophia hesitated before stepping aside to let him in. The hotel room was simple but much better than her previous living situation. Ethan could see she was trying to stay composed, but the stress of her situation was evident. "You didn't have to do all this," Sophia began, her voice trembling. "I don't want to be a burden." Ethan shook his head. "You're not a burden, Sophia. No one should have to live in fear. I can help you, if you'll let me." Sophia looked at him, searching for any sign of insincerity, but found none. Still, she was cautious. "Why are you doing this? You don't even know us." Ethan sighed, leaning back slightly. "Maybe it's because I've seen too much of what people like Steele can do to those who can't fight back. Or maybe," he paused, his expression softening, "maybe I just don't want to stand by and watch something terrible happen when I know I can prevent it." Sophia's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't have to," Ethan replied gently. "But there is something I need to ask. Who is Steele to you? Why was he after you last night?" Sophia took a deep breath, as if gathering the strength to revisit the painful memories. "Steele. He's been after me ever since I borrowed money from his boss. I didn't have any other choice. Max was sick, and I couldn't afford the hospital bills. I thought I could pay it back quickly, but—" Her voice trailed off, and she hugged Max tighter. "I'm scared, Ethan. Steele won't stop until he gets what he wants. And I'm running out of options." Ethan's mind raced, piecing together the situation. He had dealt with men like Steele before, ruthless and relentless. But something else struck him, the name of Steele's boss. It felt familiar, unsettlingly so. "Sophia," Ethan said slowly, "who does Steele work for?" Sophia hesitated before speaking, as if saying the name would summon the man himself. "He works for Leonard Graves." Ethan's expression hardened instantly. Graves. The name echoed in his mind, dredging up memories he had long buried. Years ago, Graves had been a thorn in Ethan's side during a business deal gone wrong. Their rivalry had been intense, with Graves taking every opportunity to undermine Ethan's ventures. The fact that Sophia had unwittingly fallen into Graves' web sent a chill down Ethan's spine. Graves was not just a businessman. He was a predator who thrived on exploiting the vulnerable. And now, Sophia and Max were caught in his snare. "Ethan?" Sophia's voice broke through his thoughts. He met her gaze, his mind made up. "You and Max are coming with me. I'll make sure Graves and Steele never bother you again." Sophia blinked in disbelief. "But how?" Ethan's eyes darkened with determination. "Graves and I have a history. It's time I settled it once and for all." As they left the hotel, Sophia felt a mix of relief and apprehension. She didn't fully understand the world Ethan Blake inhabited, but she sensed that aligning with him had just altered the course of her life irrevocably. And as Ethan led them into his world, neither of them knew how deep the shadows would reach, or how much it would change them both. Ethan's black sedan sped through the streets of New York, its sleek form slicing through the morning traffic with ease. Sophia sat in the passenger seat, her hands nervously gripping her seatbelt, while Max dozed quietly in the back. The enormity of the situation weighed heavily on her, but Ethan's calm presence offered a strange kind of comfort. As they drove toward Ethan's private estate in Westchester County, Sophia couldn't help but glance at him, trying to figure out the man who had so abruptly entered her life. Ethan's expression was unreadable, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, but she could sense a storm brewing beneath the surface. After a long silence, Sophia finally spoke, her voice hesitant. "Ethan, you mentioned that you and Graves have a history. What happened between you two?" Ethan's grip tightened on the steering wheel, and for a moment, Sophia thought he might not answer. But then he sighed, as if resigning himself to the fact that the past could no longer stay buried. "Graves and I crossed paths about 10 years ago," Ethan began, his voice low and steady. "He was a rising star in the financial world, ambitious and ruthless. Back then, I was expanding my business empire, and Graves saw me as a rival, someone he needed to eliminate to take my place. Sophia listened intently, sensing the depth of the rivalry between the two men. Ethan continued, his tone growing darker as he spoke. We competed for control over a tech company that was developing cutting-edge software. It was a game changer, something that could have given either of us a significant advantage. I secured the deal, but Graves didn't take the loss well. He retaliated, spreading lies, manipulating the media, and trying to sabotage my business at every turn. It was a bitter fight, one that nearly destroyed both of us. Sophia's eyes widened. What happened? I won, Ethan said simply, but there was no triumph in his voice. But it came at a cost. Graves was humiliated, and he vowed to ruin me. He disappeared for a while, but I always knew he'd resurface. Now it seems he's found a way to strike back through you. The weight of Ethan's words settled over them like a heavy cloud. Sophia realized that she and Max had unwittingly become pawns in a much larger game, one that had been set in motion long before they entered the picture. Why didn't you do something about him? Sophia asked, trying to understand why Ethan hadn't eliminated the threat once and for all. Ethan's jaw tightened. Because I thought it was over. I underestimated him. And now you're paying the price for my mistake. Sophia looked down, her thoughts racing. The danger they were in felt more real than ever, and she couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get much worse. As they approached the entrance to Ethan's estate, he turned to her, his expression softening slightly. I'm sorry you've been dragged into this, Sophia, but I promise you, I'll do everything in my power to protect you and Max. Sophia nodded, grateful for his reassurance, but the fear still lingered in her chest. What are we going to do? Ethan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pulled up to the gate of his estate, where security guards greeted him with a nod. As the gate swung open, revealing the sprawling mansion beyond, he finally spoke. First, we'll get you and Max settled in somewhere safe. Then I'm going to find out exactly what Graves is planning and how deep this goes. But one thing is certain, he won't get away with this. They drove up the driveway, passing meticulously manicured lawns and gardens. The estate was a world unto itself, far removed from the chaos of the city. But as beautiful as it was, Sophia couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. This was a fortress, and they were now caught in the middle of a war. Once inside, Ethan led them to a guest suite, where he instructed the staff to attend to their every need. Max, still half asleep, was placed gently on the bed, while Sophia stood by the window, staring out at the vast expanse of the estate. Ethan approached her, his tone serious. I need to make some calls, but I'll be back soon. Try to get some rest. Sophia nodded, though she knew sleep would be elusive. As Ethan left the room, her mind was already racing with questions and fears. She turned to look at Max, his small form curled up peacefully on the bed, and her heart ached with the uncertainty of what was to come. Meanwhile, Ethan retreated to his study, closing the door behind him. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. The line rang twice before a voice answered, calm and professional. Mr. Blake, it's been a long time. It has, Ethan replied, his voice cold. I need information on Leonard Graves. Everything you can find, and I need it fast. The person on the other end hesitated for a moment before replying. Graves has been off the radar for a while, but I'll see what I can dig up. This won't be easy. Just get it done, Ethan said, his tone leaving no room for argument. As he hung up, Ethan stared out the window, his thoughts returning to Sophia and Max. He had been so focused on protecting his empire that he had forgotten what it meant to protect people. Now, with Graves targeting them, Ethan knew he couldn't afford to fail. He would have to confront the ghosts of his past. But this time, the stakes were higher. It wasn't just his legacy on the line. It was the lives of two innocent people who had become entwined in his world of shadows. The evening sun cast long shadows across the vast lawns of Ethan Blake's estate, turning the landscape into a tableau of golden light and deepening darkness. Inside the mansion, however, tension was mounting as Ethan, Sophia, and Max became increasingly aware that the peace they had momentarily found was fragile at best. Ethan had spent the better part of the day in his study, poring over documents, making calls, and coordinating with a security team. He knew that Leonard Graves was no ordinary adversary. He was cunning, ruthless, and above all patient. The years of silence from Graves hadn't been a sign of surrender. They were the calm before the storm. Meanwhile, Sophia tried to keep herself occupied, playing with Max in the spacious living room. But her thoughts kept drifting back to the chaos that had upended their lives. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were sitting ducks, waiting for Graves to make his move. As the day wore on, Ethan's expression grew more intense, his focus unyielding. He had managed to gather some information on Graves' recent activities, but it wasn't much. Graves had covered his tracks well. The only concrete lead Ethan had was that Graves had been quietly building alliances with some of the city's most dangerous underworld figures, including Victor Steele. It was clear that Graves was preparing for something big, and Ethan knew that he needed to act before it was too late. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, Ethan emerged from his study, his face grim but determined. He found Sophia in the living room, Max asleep on the couch beside her. She looked up as he approached, her eyes searching as for any sign of hope. "We need to talk," Ethan said quietly, not wanting to wake Max. Sophia nodded, following him into the adjacent room, where they could speak in private. She could tell by the look on Ethan's face that the news wasn't good. "I've managed to dig up some information on Graves," Ethan began, keeping his voice low. "He's been lying low, but he's not working alone. He's made connections with some dangerous people, including Steele. Whatever he's planning, it's bigger than I thought." Sophia's heart sank. "What does that mean for us?" "For Max, it means we're in more danger than we realized," Ethan replied, his tone serious. "Graves is methodical. He'll come after you, Max, and anyone else he thinks will hurt me. We can't wait for him to make the first move." Sophia swallowed hard, fear gripping her. "What do we do?" Ethan's gaze was steely as he laid out his plan. "I reinforced security here, but this place can only protect us for so long. Graves is likely to try to flush us out, make us vulnerable. We need to be proactive. I'm going to confront him directly, but I need to ensure that you and Max are safe first." Sophia shook her head, her fear giving way to resolve. "I'm not going to just sit here and wait. If Graves is coming for us, we should face him together." Ethan admired her courage, but he knew what they were up against. "Sophia, I understand how you feel, but Graves is dangerous. I've dealt with men like him before. You and Max are my responsibility now, and I need to know you're safe." "Safe!" Sophia's voice trembled with a mix of anger and fear. "We're not safe anywhere, Ethan. We need to be ready, not just shielded." Ethan thought about her words. Sophia was right. They couldn't just hide and hope for the best. Graves would find a way to get to them unless they took the fight to him first. "There's one place where we might have an advantage," Ethan said after a pause. "Graves' old warehouse in Queens. It's where he ran his operations before he went underground. If we can lure him there, I might be able to outmaneuver him." Sophia looked at Ethan, uncertainty etched on her face. "You want to draw him out? Isn't that risky?" "It is," Ethan admitted. "But waiting here, hoping he doesn't find us, is even riskier. We need to force his hand, make him come to us on our terms." Sophia's mind raced as she weighed the options. Ethan was right. They couldn't afford to be passive, but the thought of putting Max at further risk was unbearable. "What about Max?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. "He's just a child." Ethan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "I have a plan for Max. I'll send him with my most trusted security team to a safe location, somewhere Graves can't reach him. He'll be well protected." Sophia hesitated, then nodded. "Okay, let's do it." The decision made, Ethan moved quickly. He summoned his head of security, outlining the plan in detail. Max would be taken to a secure location, while Ethan and Sophia would prepare to confront Graves at the warehouse. The security team would set up a perimeter, ensuring that Graves couldn't escape once he arrived. As the preparations were made, Sophia went to wake Max. She knelt beside him, gently stroking his hair. "Hey, sweetie," she whispered. "We're going on a little trip. You're going to stay with some nice people who will take care of you." Max stirred, rubbing his eyes. "But what about you, Mommy? Are you coming too?" Sophia's heart ached as she smiled down at him. "I'll be with you very soon, I promise. But for now, I need you to be brave and do what the nice people tell you, all right?" Max nodded sleepily, trusting his mother completely. As the security team arrived to escort him away, Sophia kissed his forehead, whispering reassurances she wasn't sure she believed. With Max safely on his way, Ethan and Sophia prepared to face the inevitable showdown with Graves. The battle lines were drawn, and as they left the mansion, the tension between them was palpable. They knew that this night could end in one of two ways: victory or disaster. As they drove toward Queens, the streets dark and quiet around them, Ethan reached over and took Sophia's hand, squeezing it gently. "No matter what happens tonight, we'll get through this," he said, his voice firm but tinged with the weight of the unknown. Sophia squeezed his hand back, finding strength in the connection. "We have to," she replied, her resolve hardening for Max. The car sped through the empty streets, carrying them toward the showdown that would decide their fate. The city loomed around them, silent and foreboding, as if it too was holding its breath, waiting for the battle to begin. The night air in Queens was thick with tension as Ethan Blake and Sophia approached the old warehouse. The building loomed in the darkness, its faded brick walls and windows a stark reminder of the battles that had been fought there before. For Ethan, this place was a symbol of his past conflicts with Leonard Graves, a past that was now coming back to haunt him. Sophia's heart pounded as they stepped out of the car, the cold wind biting at her skin. She looked around, feeling exposed despite the darkness. Ethan's security team had already taken up positions around the perimeter, ensuring that there would be no surprises. But the sense of unease lingered, like a shadow she couldn't shake. Ethan led the way, his expression hard as stone. He was focused, every step deliberate as they moved toward the entrance. Sophia followed closely, her thoughts drifting back to Max, now safely hidden away. She could only hope that the security team would keep him safe, but the uncertainty gnawed at her. As they reached the warehouse doors, Ethan paused, turning to Sophia. His gaze softened for a moment, the icy resolve melting just enough to reveal the man behind the mask. "I need you to stay close to me," he said quietly, his voice firm but gentle. "No matter what happens, don't leave my side." Sophia nodded, her fear tempered by the trust she had come to place in him. "I won't." With that, Ethan pushed open the doors, the rusty hinges creaking in protest. The interior was dimly lit, the faint glow of old fluorescent lights casting eerie shadows across the vast empty space. The air was thick with dust and the smell of decay, remnants of the building's long-abandoned purpose. They moved cautiously, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous room. Ethan's eyes scanned every corner, every shadow, searching for any sign of Graves or his men. But the warehouse was eerily silent, as if holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable confrontation. Suddenly, a voice broke the silence, dripping with malevolent amusement. "Ethan Blake," back where it all began. Ethan stiffened, recognizing the voice immediately. Leonard Graves stepped out from the shadows, a smug grin on his face. He was dressed in a dark suit, his posture relaxed, but his eyes gleamed with a predatory intensity. "Graves," Ethan said, his voice cold and controlled. "I should have known you want to end this here." Graves chuckled, his gaze shifting to Sophia, who stood tensely beside Ethan. "And you brought company. How charming. Tell me, Ethan, is she the reason you've been so distracted lately?" Ethan didn't rise to the bait. Leave her out of this. This is between you and me." Graves raised an eyebrow, feigning surprise. "Oh, but she's very much involved now, isn't she? After all, it's her desperation that brought us to this moment." He took a step closer, his tone turning sinister. "You always were too soft, Blake, always trying to play the hero." Sophia felt a surge of fear, but Ethan's presence beside her was a steadying force. She could see the history between the two men written in the tension of their standoff. Years of rivalry, bitterness, and unspoken grudges. Graves' eyes narrowed as he addressed Ethan. "You cost me everything, Blake. My business, my reputation. You took it all. But I'm a patient man. I've been waiting for the perfect moment to take it all back. And now here we are." Ethan remained unflinching. "You brought this on yourself, Graves. I didn't take anything from you that you weren't already on the verge of losing. Your greed, your need for power. That's what destroyed you." Graves' smile faded, replaced by a cold fury. "Maybe, but now it's time for you to lose everything, starting with her." He nodded to someone in the shadows, and before Ethan could react, two armed men stepped forward, grabbing Sophia. She struggled, but their grip was ironclad. Panic surged through her as they pulled her away from Ethan. "No!" Ethan's voice rang out, filled with a rare desperation as he moved to intervene. But Graves held up a hand, stopping him in his tracks. "One more step and she's dead," Graves warned, his tone deadly serious. Ethan froze, his eyes locked on Sophia's terrified face. For the first time in years, he felt truly powerless. The situation had spiraled out of control faster than he could have anticipated. And now, Sophia's life was hanging by a thread. Graves approached Sophia, his expression twisted with satisfaction. "You see, Ethan, the difference between you and me is that I'm willing to do whatever it takes to win. You still have a conscience, a weakness." Sophia's breath caught in her throat as Graves' cold eyes bore into hers. She could see the madness behind the twisted sense of vengeance that drove him. But as terrifying as he was, she refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. Ethan clenched his fists, his mind racing for a way out. But Graves had him cornered, and he knew it. He had to find a way to turn the tables. But time was running out. Then a sound echoed through the warehouse, the distant rumble of engines. Graves' men tensed, exchanging wary glances as the noise grew louder. Ethan recognized it immediately. The security team had arrived. Graves sneered, realizing what was happening. "So you came prepared. I should have expected as much." But before Graves could issue another command, the warehouse doors burst open and Ethan's security team stormed in, weapons drawn. The room erupted into chaos as Graves' men were quickly overwhelmed. Amid the commotion, Ethan lunged forward, taking advantage of the distraction. He reached Sophia just as one of Graves' men aimed a gun at her. With a swift, decisive movement, Ethan disarmed the man, sending him crashing to the ground. Sophia staggered back, her heart racing. But relief flooded through her as she realized she was safe. Ethan was beside her, his expression fierce as he kept a protective arm around her. Graves, seeing his plan unraveling, backed away, his face twisted in rage. "This isn't over, Blake," he shouted before turning and fleeing into the shadows of the warehouse. Ethan moved to follow him, but Sophia held him back. "Ethan, don't. He's trying to lure you into a trap." He hesitated, torn between his desire to end this once and for all and the need to protect Sophia. Finally, he nodded, knowing she was right. "We need to get out of here," Ethan said, guiding her toward the exit as the security team secured the area. They quickly made their way back to the car, the adrenaline still pumping through their veins. As they drove away from the warehouse, Sophia leaned back in her seat, trying to calm her racing heart. "That was too close," she whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan reached over, taking her hand in his. "I won't let him hurt you, Sophia. I promise." She nodded, squeezing his hand. But as they left the warehouse behind, both of them knew that this was far from over. Graves had escaped, and with him, the threat still loomed large. The battle lines had been drawn, and now they had no choice but to face whatever came next together. The morning after the harrowing confrontation at the warehouse, Ethan Blake and Sophia sat in the grand library of his estate, the early sunlight filtering through the tall windows. Despite the tranquil surroundings, the atmosphere was anything but peaceful. The events of the previous night weighed heavily on both of them, and the looming threat of Leonard Graves' next move kept their nerves on edge. Sophia stared at the untouched cup of coffee in front of her, her thoughts swirling with fear and uncertainty. Max was safe for now, hidden away with Ethan's most trusted security team, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. Graves had escaped, and his obsession with vengeance was sure to drive him to even more desperate measures. Ethan stood by the window, his gaze fixed on the horizon, lost in thought. His mind was racing, strategizing, trying to stay one step ahead of Graves. He knew they couldn't keep running forever. The only way to end this was to confront Graves head-on, to cut him off at the knees before he could strike again. As if reading his thoughts, Sophia finally broke the silence. "What do we do now, Ethan? We can't keep living like this, always looking over our shoulders." Ethan turned to her, his expression resolute. "We fight back, Sophia. We make Graves face the consequences of his actions, in a place where he can't escape. The courtroom." Sophia looked at him, confused. "The courtroom? How can we take him down there?" Ethan walked over to her, sitting down and taking her hand in his. "Graves has been operating in the shadows for years, but he's made mistakes. He's left a trail, and I have enough evidence to expose him. But it's not just about bringing him to justice. We need to make sure he has no power left to hurt anyone else." Sophia listened intently, the pieces starting to fall into place. "You mean you want to take him to court? Sue him?" "Exactly," Ethan replied, his voice firm. "But it's more than just a lawsuit. We'll press charges, fraud, extortion, conspiracy. We'll expose everything he's done, drag his name through the mud. And when the world sees him for what he truly is, his empire will crumble." Sophia felt a surge of hope. It was a bold plan, but it made sense. Graves thrived on secrecy and manipulation. But if they could bring his crimes into the light, he'd be finished. "But won't that be dangerous?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. "What if he tries to stop us?" Ethan's expression darkened. "He'll try. But this time, we'll be ready." They spent the next few hours gathering everything they needed. Ethan contacted his legal team, a group of sharp, relentless attorneys who had handled some of the toughest cases in the country. Sophia, with Ethan's help, compiled every piece of evidence she had, including her own experiences with Graves and Steele. It was a daunting task, but they both knew it was their best shot at ending this nightmare. 2 days later, the lawsuit was filed. The charges against Graves were severe, and the legal papers detailed a web of criminal activity that spanned years. It was a direct hit to Graves' empire, and they knew it wouldn't go unanswered. The media quickly picked up on the story. Headlines blared across every news outlet, painting Graves as a criminal mastermind who had finally been caught in his own trap. For Ethan, it was a calculated move. The more public the case, the harder it would be for Graves to retaliate without scrutiny. But the calm before the storm was short-lived. As the date for the first hearing approached, threats began to trickle in. Anonymous calls, shadowy figures lurking near the estate. Subtle but unmistakable signs that Graves was preparing to strike back. Ethan increased security measures, but the tension was palpable. Then, on the day of the hearing, it all came to a head. The courthouse was swarming with reporters, eager for a glimpse of the drama unfolding inside. Ethan and Sophia arrived early, flanked by security, but the unease hung heavy in the air. As they walked through the courthouse doors, every step felt like a march into enemy territory. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Graves was already there, sitting at the defense table, his expression as cold and unyielding as ever. He barely acknowledged Ethan and Sophia as they took their seats, but the tension between them crackled like electricity. The judge called court to order, and the proceedings began. Ethan's lead attorney, a sharp-witted woman named Emily Carter, presented their case with precision and confidence. She outlined the charges, detailing the evidence they had gathered: fraudulent business practices, money laundering, ties to organized crime. The case was strong, and everyone in the room could see it. But Graves' defense team was equally prepared. They countered point with practiced ease, casting doubt on the evidence, questioning the credibility of witnesses. It was a battle of wits, each side pushing and probing for weaknesses. Sophia sat beside Ethan, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew this was just the beginning, but the stakes felt impossibly high. Every word spoken in that courtroom felt like a step closer to victory or defeat. Then, as the day wore on, something unexpected happened. A new witness was called to the stand, someone Ethan hadn't anticipated. A former associate of Graves, a man named Victor Cruz, who had turned state's evidence in exchange for immunity. His testimony was a bombshell. He confirmed everything Ethan and Sophia had suspected, detailing Graves' criminal activities, his connections to dangerous figures like Steele, and his plans to retaliate. But as Cruz spoke, Sophia noticed something off. Graves' calm demeanor had cracked, just slightly. His eyes narrowed, his posture stiffened, and then it hit her. Cruz wasn't just another witness. He was a plant, a tool Graves was using to manipulate the situation. As Cruz's testimony continued, Sophia's unease grew. She leaned over to Ethan, whispering urgently, "Ethan, something's wrong." "Cruz, he's setting us up." Ethan frowned, watching Cruz closely. The man was too smooth, too rehearsed. And then it clicked. Cruz was feeding them just enough truth to make them overconfident, but his ultimate goal was to discredit the entire case. Before Ethan could react, Cruz dropped a bombshell of his own. He claimed that Ethan had been involved in illegal dealings with Graves years ago, implying that the lawsuit was nothing more than a ploy to cover his tracks. The courtroom erupted in chaos as the defense pounced on the revelation, demanding that the case be dismissed. Ethan's attorney quickly objected, but the damage was done. The judge called for an emergency recess, and Ethan and Sophia were left reeling from the unexpected blow. As they exited the courtroom, the weight of what had just happened settled over them like a heavy fog. The media was already swarming, cameras flashing, reporters shouting questions. But all Ethan could think about was how Graves had managed to turn the tables so swiftly. In the safety of a private conference room, Ethan and Sophia huddled with their legal team, trying to make sense of the situation. Emily Carter was furious, pacing the room as she vented her frustration. "Reyes is lying through his teeth, but he's good. The jury might buy it if we don't counter this fast," Samantha said, her tone sharp. Jonathan remained calm, though his mind was racing. "We need to discredit Reyes before he can do more damage. Dig into his background. Find out what Kessler's holding over him." Mia, still shaken, spoke up. "What if we can't? What if this was Kessler's plan all along?" Jonathan looked at her, his expression softening. "Then we find another way. We're not done yet, Mia. We knew this wouldn't be easy." As the legal team regrouped and prepared their next move, Jonathan and Mia realized that the courtroom battle had only just begun. The stakes were higher than ever, and Kessler was playing for keeps. But Jonathan wasn't about to let him win. Not now. Not when they were so close. As the day ended and they left the courthouse, the city lights flickering in the distance, Jonathan felt a renewed sense of determination. Kessler had played his hand, but so had they. The game was far from over, and Jonathan was ready for whatever came next. The days following the courtroom ambush were a blur of tension and strategizing. Jonathan Hale, usually so composed, was grappling with a situation that had spiraled dangerously out of control. The accusations from Victor Reyes had left a stain on his reputation, and Kessler's manipulations had cast a shadow over the entire case. But Jonathan knew that retreat wasn't an option. His legacy and Mia and Lucas's safety depended on how he played his next move. Mia, too, felt the weight of the situation. She had seen Jonathan weather countless storms, but this was different. She could sense the strain in his every movement, the burden of knowing that Kessler had pulled them into a trap. But she also saw the determination in his eyes, the fire that refused to be extinguished. It gave her strength, reminding her that they were in this together. One evening, after another long day of legal meetings and damage control, Jonathan and Mia sat together in his study. The room was dimly lit, the soft glow of the fireplace casting flickering shadows on the walls. Outside, the night was cold, a stark contrast to the storm brewing in their lives. Mia broke the silence, her voice soft but steady. "Jonathan, what if we can't clear your name? What if Kessler's plan works?" Jonathan looked at her, his expression unreadable. He had been asking himself the same question, but hearing it aloud made the reality of the situation even sharper. "We'll find a way," he said, though the usual certainty in his voice was tempered by the enormity of the challenge ahead. "Reyes is lying, and we'll prove it. But this isn't just about clearing my name, Mia. It's about taking Kessler down for good." Mia nodded, understanding the gravity of what he was saying. "So, what's our next move?" Jonathan leaned forward, his gaze intense. "We go after Kessler's foundation, the one thing he values above all else, his reputation. Rhea's testimony might have shaken us, but it also gave us a clue. If Kessler was willing to risk planting Reyes in our case, it means he's hiding something even bigger. We just need to find it." Mia frowned, trying to follow his logic. "But how do we get to him? He's already shown he'll do anything to win." Jonathan's expression hardened. "We take a different approach. Kessler is proud of his legacy, the public face he's built. If we can expose the corruption at the heart of his empire, we'll force him into a corner. He won't be able to hide behind his lies anymore." Mia thought for a moment, then nodded. "So we dig deeper. We find the dirt he's been covering up." "Exactly," Jonathan said. "And we have an advantage. Kessler's arrogance makes him think he's untouchable. But everyone has skeletons in their closet. We just need to pull them out." The next few days were spent in a relentless pursuit of the truth. Jonathan's legal team worked around the clock, sifting through years of financial records, old business deals, and connections that might lead back to Kessler's illicit activities. Jonathan reached out to old contacts, pulling favors and gathering information that might give them an edge. Mia, despite her fear and uncertainty, threw herself into the effort as well. She combed through every document, every piece of evidence they had, searching for patterns and connections that might have been missed. It was exhausting work, but it kept her mind focused, pushing back the gnawing anxiety that threatened to overwhelm her. Finally, after days of digging, they found something, a thread, barely noticeable at first, that led them to a hidden network of shell companies, all tied back to Kessler. The transactions were intricate, designed to obscure the flow of money and the true nature of the deals being made. But it was enough to show that Kessler had been laundering money for years, using his businesses as fronts for criminal activity. It was the break they needed. Jonathan's team quickly moved to compile the evidence, preparing to present it in court. They knew Kessler would try to counter it, but the sheer volume of information they had uncovered was overwhelming. If they could get it in front of a judge, it could turn the tide in their favor. As the day of the hearing approached, the tension mounted. The media frenzy surrounding the case had only intensified, with reporters speculating on every possible outcome. Kessler, true to form, had doubled down on his attacks, using every resource at his disposal to discredit Jonathan and his team. But Jonathan remained focused. He knew this was their best chance to expose Kessler for who he truly was. The legacy Jonathan had built, the empire he had spent years creating, was on the line. But more importantly, the lives of Mia and Lucas hung in the balance. The morning of the hearing, Jonathan and Mia arrived at the courthouse early, accompanied by their legal team. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation, the air thick with the weight of what was to come. As they entered the courtroom, Jonathan could feel the eyes of the world on him, but he forced himself to stay calm. Kessler was already there, seated at the defense table with his high-powered attorneys. His expression was as cold and calculating as ever, but there was a flicker of something else in his eyes, a hint of uncertainty. The judge entered, calling the court to order. Samantha Lee, Jonathan's lead attorney, began her presentation, laying out the evidence they had uncovered. The courtroom was silent as she detailed the web of financial corruption, the money laundering schemes, and the ties to organized crime. The evidence was damning, and even Kessler's attorney struggled to counter it. But just as it seemed they had the upper hand, Kessler made his move. He stood, addressing the court with a confidence that made Jonathan's stomach churn. "Your Honor, while these allegations are serious, they are based on circumstantial evidence. My client has a long-standing reputation for integrity, and these claims are nothing more than a desperate attempt to tarnish his name." Jonathan felt a surge of anger, but he kept his expression neutral. He knew Kessler was playing his last card, trying to twist the narrative in his favor. Then Kessler dropped the bombshell. "Furthermore, I would like to submit new evidence," Kessler continued, handing a document to the judge. "This evidence shows that Mr. Hale himself has been involved in questionable dealings, using his influence to manipulate the outcome of this case." The courtroom erupted in gasps and whispers. Jonathan's heart sank as he saw the judge's expression harden. Kessler had set a trap, and they had walked right into it. Samantha quickly objected, demanding to see the evidence. But the damage was already done. The judge called for a recess, and Jonathan and Mia were left to face the fallout. In the conference room, Samantha was furious. "He's playing us, Jonathan. That evidence is a fabrication, but it's enough to cast doubt. We're back on the defensive." Jonathan clenched his fists, trying to control his frustration. "We can't let him get away with this. We need to fight back harder than ever." Mia, who had been silent, finally spoke. "There's one more thing we haven't considered." Jonathan and Samantha turned to her, listening intently. "Kessler's using our own tactics against us. He's trying to bury us in legal maneuvering, but he's forgotten one thing: the truth. We need to go back to the beginning, to the heart of what this is really about. Expose him not just as a criminal, but as the man who destroyed lives to build his empire." Samantha nodded slowly. "She's right. We need to make this personal. Kessler thrives on his image. If we can shatter that, we can break him." Jonathan looked at Mia, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "Then that's what we'll do. We expose Kessler for who he really is, not just to the court, but to the world. We need to humanize this, bring it down to a level the jury can connect with," Samantha said, her tone firm. Jonathan nodded in agreement. "And we start with Sophia. Her story, her experiences with Graves, it's powerful. If we can show the court who he really is, not just what he's done, we might still have a chance." The next day in court, Sophia took the stand. She spoke clearly, her voice steady as she recounted the threats, the fear, and the impact Graves had on her life and on Max. The courtroom was silent as she described the terror of being caught in Graves' web and the lengths Ethan had gone to protect her and her son. As she spoke, Ethan watched Graves' expression change. The arrogance faded, replaced by something else, anger and perhaps a hint of fear. Sophia's testimony was raw, unfiltered, and it struck a chord with everyone in the room. When she finished, the courtroom was still. The judge, clearly moved by her story, looked over at Graves with a newfound scrutiny. The tide was turning again, but this time in their favor. As the trial neared its conclusion, Ethan knew they had one last shot to bring Graves down. It wasn't just about winning the case anymore. It was about ensuring that Graves could never hurt anyone else again. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as Sophia stepped down from the witness stand, her testimony still hanging in the air like a ghostly presence. Ethan Blake, watched her with a mix of pride and fear, knowing that her words had struck deep into the heart of their case against Leonard Graves. But he also knew that they were far from the finish line. Graves was a master manipulator, and Ethan couldn't afford to underestimate him. Not when they were so close to the end. The judge called for a brief recess, allowing both sides to regroup before the final arguments. Ethan and Sophia retreated to a private room with Emily Carter and the rest of their legal team. The mood was somber, despite the glimmer of hope Sophia's testimony had provided. Emily paced the room, her mind working overtime. We've got Graves on the ropes, but he's not out yet. We need to seal this with our closing argument. It has to be bulletproof. Ethan nodded, his gaze distant as he processed the gravity of the situation. Graves is going to try something in his closing statement. He always has a trick up his sleeve. Sophia, still shaken but determined, spoke up. What if we expose him before he has a chance? Bring out everything we've gathered, the shell companies, the money laundering, the threats. We can't give him any room to twist the truth. Emily stopped pacing, considering Sophia's suggestion. It's risky, but it might be our best shot. We lay everything bare, force him into a corner where he can't escape. Ethan agreed, his voice steady. We need to be aggressive. Graves thrives on fear and doubt. If we show the jury the full extent of his crimes, they won't have a choice but to see him for what he really is. As they finalized their strategy, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the next few hours would decide everything. His mind wandered to Max, safe but far away, and he knew that whatever happened, he had to protect him and Sophia. Graves had taken too much already, and Ethan wasn't about to let him take any more. The courtroom filled with spectators once again as the recess ended. The air was thick with anticipation, the weight of the trial's outcome pressing down on everyone present. Ethan took his seat, his eyes never leaving Graves, who sat across the room with an air of forced calm. The judge called the court to order, and Graves' lead attorney rose to deliver their closing argument. It was a masterful performance, painting Graves as a victim of a vindictive attack by Ethan Blake, a man desperate to save his crumbling empire. The attorney spoke of doubt, of circumstantial evidence, and of the dangers of convicting an innocent man based on conjecture. But Ethan could see the cracks in Graves' facade. The attorney's words were carefully chosen, but they couldn't hide the underlying fear that Graves was finally being exposed. When it was Emily's turn, she stood with the confidence of someone who knew she had the truth on her side. She began by recapping the evidence, piece by piece, painting a picture of Graves as a man who had built his empire on lies, manipulation, and the suffering of others. She highlighted Sophia's testimony, the shell companies, the financial records, all pointing to a calculated criminal operation that had left countless lives in ruins. But it was her final words that struck the deepest. Leonard Graves has spent years hiding behind a veneer of respectability, Emily said, her voice ringing clear in the silent courtroom. He's used his wealth and influence to silence his victims, to destroy those who stand in his way. But today, we have the chance to make things right, to show that no one, no matter how powerful, is above the law. As Emily sat down, the tension in the room was almost unbearable. The jury was given their instructions, and they retired to deliberate. The waiting began. Ethan and Sophia returned to the private room with their team, the hours stretching into what felt like an eternity. Every minute that passed weighed heavily on them, the uncertainty gnawing at their nerves. Ethan tried to stay composed, but the stakes had never been higher. This was more than just a legal battle. It was a fight for their lives, their future. Finally, after what felt like an age, there was a knock at the door. A court officer entered, informing them that the jury had reached a verdict. The word sent a chill down Ethan's spine, and as they made their way back to the courtroom, he felt the full weight of what was about to happen. The courtroom was silent as the jury filed back in. The foreman stood, holding the piece of paper that would determine their fate. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, and he could feel Sophia's hand trembling in his. The judge asked the foreman to deliver the verdict. In the case of Ethan Blake versus Leonard Graves, on the charges of fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy, we find the defendant, Leonard Graves, guilty on all counts. The words hung in the air, their impact immediate and profound. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom, followed by a surge of whispers. Ethan felt a wave of relief wash over him, the tension in his body finally releasing. He looked at Sophia, who had tears in her eyes, a mixture of joy and disbelief. They had done it. They had won. But the moment of triumph was cut short as the judge called for order. Graves, his composure shattered, stood up, shouting in protest. "This is a farce. I'll appeal. You haven't seen the last of me." The judge banged his gavel, demanding silence. But Graves' outburst had already caused a stir. Ethan watched as security moved in, restraining Graves and escorting him out of the courtroom. His last words echoed in Ethan's mind, a chilling reminder that Graves wasn't one to go down quietly. As the courtroom emptied, Ethan and Sophia remained seated, absorbing the reality of what had just happened. The victory was theirs, but the battle had taken its toll. They had won the trial. But Graves' threat still lingered in the air, a dark cloud over their hard-fought triumph. Back at the estate that evening, the atmosphere was subdued. There were no celebrations, no champagne toasts. The weight of the past weeks hung heavily over them, and the fear of what might come next tempered any sense of relief. Sophia sat by the fireplace, watching the flames dance, while Ethan stood at the window, staring out into the night. After a long silence, Sophia spoke. "We did it, didn't we?" Ethan turned to her, a small, weary smile on his face. "We did. But it's not over, Sophia. Graves will fight this with everything he has." Sophia nodded, her expression resolute. "We'll be ready. Whatever he throws at us, we'll be ready." Ethan walked over to her, sitting down beside her. He took her hand in his, squeezing it gently. "I promise you I'd protect you and Max, and I intend to keep that promise. No matter what happens, we'll face it together." Sophia leaned into him, finding comfort in his presence. The fire crackled softly, casting a warm glow over them. They had won the battle, but the war was far from over. As they sat there, side by side, they knew that the final showdown with Graves was looming on the horizon. But for now, in the quiet of the evening, they allowed themselves a moment of peace, a brief respite from the storm that still raged around them. They had fought hard to get to this point, and they would fight even harder to protect what they had won. The tension was unbearable as Ethan Blake stood at the threshold of his estate, the cold night air pressing down on him. His heart pounded in his chest, not from fear, but from the adrenaline surging through his veins. He had faced countless threats in his life, but nothing compared to the danger that now bore down on him and the people he loved. Leonard Graves had finally made his move, and the time for confrontation had come. Ethan knew that Graves wouldn't come at him directly. He was a master manipulator, preferring to use pawns to do his bidding. But tonight, Ethan had forced Graves' hand, luring him into a situation where the two of them would have to face off, man to man. And this time, there would be no backing down. Inside the estate, Sophia clung to Max as they huddled in the safe room deep beneath the house. The faint sounds of gunfire and shouts echoed through the walls, making her heart race with every distant boom. She could barely breathe, fear gripping her with every passing second. But she trusted Ethan. He had promised to protect them, and she had to believe that he would. "Mommy, are we going to be okay?" Max's small voice trembled as he looked up at her with wide, innocent eyes. Sophia forced a smile, brushing a lock of hair away from his face. "Yes, sweetheart, we're going to be just fine. We just have to stay here a little longer, okay?" Max nodded, though the fear in his eyes remained. Sophia's heart broke for him, for the innocence that had been shattered by the events of the past weeks. She held him close, praying silently that Ethan would come back to them. Above ground, Ethan moved with precision and purpose, navigating the darkened hallways of the estate with the familiarity of a man who knew every inch of his home. The gunfire outside had subsided, a tense silence falling over the grounds. Ethan knew that Graves' men had been dealt with, but the real threat was still out there, lurking in the shadows. He reached the front of the house, where the grand doors had been left ajar, swaying slightly in the wind. Ethan's senses were on high alert as he stepped outside, the night enveloping him in its cold embrace. He could feel Graves' presence, the invisible pull of an old enemy who was too close for comfort. Then he saw him. Leonard Graves stood at the edge of the driveway, partially concealed by the shadows cast by the tall oaks that lined the property. His stance was relaxed, almost casual, as if this were just another business meeting instead of a deadly confrontation. But Ethan could see the tension in Graves' frame, the barely concealed fury in his eyes. "Graves," Ethan called out, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "It's over. There's nowhere left for you to run." Graves stepped forward, the faint light from the house illuminating his features. He looked every bit the part of a man who had been cornered, yet there was no fear in his eyes. Instead, there was a dangerous glint, a maniacal resolve that sent a chill down Ethan's spine. "You think you've won, Blake?" Graves' voice was low, venomous. "This is far from over." Ethan's grip on his gun tightened. "You're out of options, Graves. You can't keep running. It's time to end this." Graves chuckled darkly, the sound hollow and sinister. "You still don't get it, do you? You might have taken my empire, ruined my reputation, but you'll never truly defeat me. Men like us, we don't just disappear." Ethan's jaw clenched. "I'm not like you, Graves. I don't destroy lives for sport. You've hurt too many people, and it ends tonight." Graves' eyes narrowed, a twisted smile curling on his lips. "Do you really think you're any different? You built your empire on the same foundations I did. Power, control, fear. It's all the same. The only difference is, I'm not afraid to admit it." Ethan's resolve hardened. "I'm nothing like you, and I'm going to make sure you never hurt anyone again." In a flash, Graves reached into his coat, pulling out a gun. But Ethan was quicker. He fired a shot, the bullet hitting Graves square in the shoulder. Graves staggered back, a look of shock crossing his face as he dropped his weapon. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. Ethan kept his gun trained on Graves, watching as the man who had tormented him for so long fell to his knees. Graves clutched his bleeding shoulder. The cocky smile finally wiped from his face. You think this changes anything?" Graves spat, his voice weak but defiant. "You'll never be free of me, Blake. I'll haunt you until the end of your days." Ethan's gaze was steely, unmoved by Graves' threats. "You're done, Graves. It's over." Graves looked up at him, a flicker of something like fear in his eyes. But it was too late for redemption, too late for anything but the consequences of his own actions. The once powerful man crumpled to the ground, the last of his strength fading as darkness closed in. Ethan lowered his gun, breathing heavily as the adrenaline began to subside. It was over. After all the years of rivalry, manipulation, and bloodshed, Leonard Graves was finally defeated. But the victory felt hollow, tainted by the lives that had been lost and the price that had been paid. Sirens wailed in the distance as the authorities arrived, drawn by the chaos of the night. Ethan's security team moved quickly, securing the scene and tending to the wounded. But Ethan's mind was elsewhere. He needed to see Sophia and Max, to hold them and know that they were safe. He turned and headed back inside. The cold night air a stark contrast to the warmth that flooded through him as he descended the stairs to the safe room. He opened the heavy door, and there they were, Sophia, holding Max tightly, both of them safe and sound. Sophia's eyes met his, relief washing over her as she saw him. "Ethan, is it over?" Ethan nodded, his voice soft as he approached them. "Yes, it's over." Max ran to him, wrapping his small arms around Ethan's legs. Ethan scooped him up, holding him close as he looked at Sophia. She reached out, placing a hand on his cheek, her touch grounding him in a way that nothing else could. "Thank you." Sophia whispered, tears in her eyes. "You saved us." Ethan shook his head, emotion thick in his voice. "We saved each other." They stood there for a long moment, the three of them united in a way that transcended the horrors of the night. The storm had broken, and in its aftermath, there was a sense of peace, fragile but real. As they emerged from the safe room, the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon. The estate, battered but still standing, was a symbol of the trials they had endured. And as the sun rose, casting its golden light over the world, it brought with it the promise of a new beginning. Ethan knew that there would be challenges ahead. The road to healing was long, and the scars of the past would take time to fade. But he also knew that he wasn't alone. Sophia and Max were by his side, and together, they would face whatever the future held. As they stepped out into the morning light, Ethan took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the night's events begin to lift. The empire of shadows that had once threatened to consume him was crumbling, and in its place, a new life was beginning to take shape. For the first time in a long time, Ethan Blake felt hope. And as he looked at Sophia and Max, he knew that they were the reason for it. They had fought through the darkness, and now, together, they would build a future filled with light. The first light of dawn broke over the horizon, casting a soft, golden glow across the landscape. The estate, which had been the scene of so much chaos and danger just hours before, now stood quiet and peaceful. The air was cool, and the scent of dew-covered grass filled the morning with a sense of renewal. For Ethan Blake, this dawn was more than just the start of a new day. It was the beginning of a new life. Inside the estate, the atmosphere was heavy with the aftermath of the previous night's events. The tension that had gripped the household had finally begun to ease. But the memories of the confrontation with Leonard Graves still lingered in the air. Ethan, Sophia, and Max had spent the night in the safe room, huddled together as the last echoes of gunfire faded into the silence. Now, as the sun rose, Ethan stood by the large windows of the living room, looking out over the estate grounds. The sight of the morning light filtering through the trees brought a sense of calm that he hadn't felt in a long time. The danger had passed, and with it, the relentless pressure that had driven him for so long. Sophia entered the room quietly, her footsteps soft on the polished floor. She had spent the last hour making sure Max was comfortable, finally allowing herself to believe that they were safe. When she saw Ethan standing by the window, she walked over to him, slipping her hand into his. He turned to her, a faint smile on his lips. "How's Max?" Ethan asked, his voice gentle. "He's sleeping," Sophia replied, leaning her head against his shoulder. "He was so exhausted after everything that happened, but he's okay. We're okay." Ethan nodded, wrapping an arm around her and pulling her closer. "I'm sorry, Sophia, for everything. I never wanted you or Max to be caught up in all of this." Sophia looked up at him, her eyes filled with emotion. "You don't have to apologize, Ethan. You did everything you could to protect us, and you did. We're safe because of you." Ethan's gaze softened as he looked at her, the weight of her words sinking in. He had spent so much of his life building walls around himself, driven by the need to protect his empire at all costs. But now, for the first time, he realized that those walls had crumbled, replaced by something far more meaningful. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said quietly, his voice thick with sincerity. "You gave me something worth fighting for. Both of you did." Sophia smiled, her heart swelling with affection for the man who had risked everything for her and her son. She knew that they had been through hell, but she also knew that they had emerged stronger for it. The bond they had forged in the fire of adversity was unbreakable. As they stood there together, the sun continued to rise, bathing the room in warm light. The events of the past weeks, the fear, the uncertainty, the battles fought in the shadows, began to fade into memory, replaced by the promise of a brighter future. A soft knock on the door interrupted the moment, and Ethan turned to see his head of security, standing in the doorway, a look of cautious relief on his face. "Mr. Blake, the authorities have arrived. They've secured the estate, and are waiting to speak with you." Ethan nodded, his expression serious but calm. "Thank you. I'll be there shortly." As the security officer left, Ethan turned back to Sophia. "I need to handle this, but it won't take long. Then we can finally start putting this all behind us." Sophia squeezed his hand. "I'll be here when you're done." "We'll be here." With one last glance at her, Ethan left the room and made his way to the front of the estate. Outside, the grounds were bustling with activity as law enforcement officers and investigators combed through the scene. The remnants of the night's battle were stark against the serene backdrop of the estate, but Ethan felt a sense of closure as he surveyed the scene. He spoke with the authorities, providing them with the details of what had transpired and ensuring that Graves' reign of terror would be fully documented. The officers assured him that the evidence they had gathered was more than enough to ensure that Graves' remaining allies would be brought to justice. Ethan knew that it would take time to dismantle the empire Graves had built, but he was confident that the worst was behind them. After wrapping up his conversation with the lead investigator, Ethan returned to the house. The weight that had been on his shoulders for so long was finally beginning to lift, and with each step, he felt more like himself again, but a version of himself that had been irrevocably changed by the people who now waited for him inside. When he entered the living room, he found Sophia and Max sitting on the couch, the morning sunlight streaming in through the windows. Max was awake, his small face still showing signs of the night's fear, but also a quiet strength that belied his age. Sophia looked up as Ethan approached, her eyes full of warmth and gratitude. "Everything's taken care of," Ethan said as he sat down beside them. "The authorities are handling the rest." Sophia nodded, her hand finding his. "What happens now?" Ethan looked at her, then at Max, and for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to think about the future, not as a battlefield, but as a blank canvas, waiting to be filled with new possibilities. "Now," he said, his voice filled with a quiet determination, "we start over together." Sophia smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "I'd like that." Max, sensing the shift in the air, looked up at Ethan with a small, hopeful smile. "Are we going to be okay now?" Ethan leaned down, ruffling the boy's hair. "Yes, Max, we're going to be okay." And as they sat there, the three of them wrapped in the warmth of the morning sun, Ethan felt a sense of peace that he hadn't known in years. The empire of shadows that had once threatened to consume him had been vanquished, and in its place, a new life was beginning to take shape. For Ethan, Sophia, and Max, the future was no longer something to be feared. It was something to be embraced, built on the foundation of the love and strength they had found in each other. As the day unfolded, they began to make plans, not for business deals or battles, but for the simple joys of life that had been so elusive for so long. They talked about trips they would take, things they would do together as a family, and the life they would build, free from the shadows of the past. And as the sun rose higher in the sky, casting its light over the world, Ethan knew that this was the beginning of something truly beautiful. A new dawn had come, and with it, the promise of a future filled with hope, love, and the unbreakable bond of family. If you enjoyed this heartwarming story about overcoming challenges and family love, don't forget to like the video, comment on what touched you the most, and subscribe to the channel. Stay tuned for our next exciting story.